Gail looked at Chad, the man she had once considered so dear and understanding, and couldn't believe what he had just said. Of course, he had always treated his mother and sister with love and tenderness, trying to take care of them, and how could it be otherwise? The father of the family had died when Chad was in school, leaving him as the only man and support for his closest relatives. From a young age, Chad felt responsible for his mother and sister, defending, protecting, and supporting them. Undoubtedly, these were wonderful qualities. Gail had initially admired his attitude toward his family, but soon she realized that her spouse was simply being used. Well, such relationships had formed between the relatives, and perhaps it wasn't her place to meddle in the affairs of adults. But the situation had imperceptibly begun to spiral out of control. Soon, Gail found herself somehow indebted to her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, presumably because she had dared to take away their only helper. After all, Gail was young, well-educated, and married to a wonderful man. She had a reliable, loving husband. How lucky she was, her in-laws would say. And how a pity it was that Alison, Chad's sister, had faced misfortune. Abandoned by her lover while pregnant, who had vanished without a trace, leaving her to raise their son alone. The mother-in-law, Rebecca, had remained a widow, raising 2 children by herself. Now, with failing health and diminishing strength, she still had to help her daughter and grandson. These 2 defenceless, unfortunate women, with their complicated destinies, stood in stark contrast to lucky Gail, who had supposedly been blessed with so much happiness in life. By their strange logic, this meant that she also owed some support to these 2 destitute souls. Gail had turned a blind eye to it all until now, but today Chad's words were too much. She finally snapped and told her spouse everything that had been building up inside her. After this, she suddenly felt lighter, and Chad appeared deep in thought. Speaking so directly wasn't in Gail's nature, but now she felt no regret. On the contrary, she rejoiced at finally finding her voice. Gail and Chad had met right after graduation, working at the same company. He in engineering, she in the economic department. They were both young, inexperienced specialists, eager to work, somewhat ambitious, and energetic. They had much in common. Naturally, they quickly grew close, with an instant mutual attraction. Chad had been open about his feelings, expressing them directly to his young girlfriend. His sincere words had given Gail goosebumps. She felt the same way, genuinely drawn to this handsome, mature, and responsible young man. As they grew closer, Gail began to understand the source of his practical nature and household skills, qualities that had assured her she'd found someone dependable. Since adolescence, Chad had assumed his father's role. His mother and sister had remained stunned and confused for a long time after their loss. The boy had been forced to take charge and care for his relatives. All household maintenance fell to Chad, fixing faucets, hanging wallpaper, dealing with faulty switches. He even started working part-time, first at a car wash after school, then as a server at a fast food restaurant. His mother's job paid poorly, and her endless illnesses prevented her from seeking better employment. Who would hire such a worker? Besides, the theatre where she worked as a cloakroom attendant was conveniently close to home, and there were many other excuses. Chad's income helped support the family. Who else could do it but him? Alison was Chad's younger sister, though the age gap was small. While her brother had matured quickly after their father's death, Alison had remained a fragile, defenceless child for far too long. Their mother had constantly impressed upon Chad his obligation to protect and care for his sister. "She's so fragile, so tender, so naive," she used to say. Chad tried his best, desperate for his mother's approval, and wanting to live in a way that would have made his late father proud. Gail had pieced this all together from his stories, though Chad himself seemed blind to how his mother and sister manipulated his noble feelings. Back then, she hadn't dared express her opinion to him. First, she wasn't entirely confident in her conclusions. Second, she knew that meddling in another's family's dynamics was dangerous territory. Still, she pitied Chad. He struggled to advance his career while trying to be everything to his mother and Alison. His exhaustion was evident. Alison had been a demanding and spoiled creature since childhood, constantly requiring attention and adoration. That was simply her nature. She possessed no outstanding qualities. Ordinary, unremarkable appearance, short, slightly overweight. Her eyes were beautiful, though, a wonderful turquoise shade. Alison emphasized this unique feature with makeup and clothes, considering herself an irresistible beauty and intellectual. Alison started dating boys early on. They gave her what she craved most: admiring looks, compliments, attention. It wasn't free, of course, but Alison was willing to barter for the sake of feeling unique and popular. Boys followed her in hordes, much to other girls' envy. Alison had found an easy path to such fame, considering it a small price to pay for being the school queen. Though, in Gail's firm conviction, Alison was only a queen in her own eyes. Chad couldn't rest easy about his sister's turbulent personal life. He felt responsible for her, but couldn't keep up with the young beauty, physically lacking the strength between school and work. As for their mother, she saw nothing wrong with her daughter's numerous romances. "What's wrong with that? Alison is beautiful and has the right to date whoever she wants. She's smart. She won't make mistakes. She'll find a rich husband and live well. Is that so bad?" she would say. "Looking at her, I realise I missed out in my youth. Alison is right. When else should she go out if not now?" Chad never told his mother about the school rumours concerning his sister. Why worry her? He tried handling Alison's suitors himself. But what could he do when his sister opposed his intervention? Time passed. Chad graduated from school and entered university on a scholarship. Rebecca rejoiced for her eldest, but shared her concerns. "I thought you'd grown up and would start earning good money, at least in construction," she said. "Do you know how much our neighbour's grandson makes there without any education? And here you are back to studying. What about us?" Chad assured his mother he would keep his cafe job and might find something better, and the woman somewhat settled down. Alison's final year of school was tumultuous. She had a new boyfriend. Not some boy her age, but a young businessman she met online, or so she claimed. He lived in a distant city on the other side of the country. He owned a business dealing with fish deliveries. Alison didn't care about the details. The young lady was solemnly interested in admiring Tom's photos. There he was in his luxury car, there posing against palm trees at an expensive resort. The young man seemed to live well, his business apparently thriving. After New Year's holidays, Tom decided to visit his beloved. Yes, beloved. By then their long-distance romance had gained considerable momentum. Alison didn't inform her family. She spent a long time preparing and doing her makeup before meeting her beloved. Chad immediately knew his sister was going on a date. He tried asking questions, but she wouldn't admit anything. Only much later did she tell her brother the truth, when nothing could be done. Alison vanished for 3 days. Not completely, of course. She called her mother, lying about staying at various friends' houses. Rebecca believed her, unlike Chad, who remained suspicious. It turned out Tom had rented a room for 3 days in a local hotel, not the best in the city, as Alison had hoped. Tom turned out to be quite stingy, avoiding restaurants and ordering only pizza to the room. He spoke many beautiful words to his young mistress, and she tried her best to charm him further, dreaming he would take her into his seemingly rich and bright life of resorts, expensive cars and beautiful houses. 3 days later, Tom claimed he needed to return home for work. They parted well, but then the young man simply vanished, stopped all contact, and deleted his social media profile, leaving Alison unable to reach him. She sobbed for days over this betrayal, regretting that she wouldn't be a businessman's wife who wouldn't need to work or study. However, the girl quickly recovered, starting a new romance to distract herself. 3 months later, on the eve of final exams, Alison discovered she was pregnant, too long-term for any other options. The timing pointed to the elusive businessman as the father. Alison had no phone number or address. They had only communicated through social media, which he'd deleted, right after leaving her for business. Chad found contacts who helped recover Tom's profile. They quickly discovered all his photos of a successful businessman's lifestyle were fake. Tom himself, if that was even his name, couldn't be found. There was no hope he would appear voluntarily, and so Chad's family gained another member. Alison named her baby Lewis. After graduating and giving birth, Alison didn't consider further education. How could she study while raising a child? It seemed to her an impossible task that few could manage. Her mother supported this decision, though Chad disagreed. He believed his sister could manage correspondence courses, especially since their mother worked part-time and could watch the child. But the young man was used to agreeing to his mother and sister, so now he also accepted their choice. He had to find better-paying work. After all, his family had grown by one more person. And so they lived, raising Lewis together. Alison neither studied nor planned to. She worked part-time occasionally, but would quickly tire and quit to stay with the child. By the time Chad and Gail met, Lewis was already a first grader, sensible and quite independent for his age. Gail couldn't understand why the boy needed constant supervision. In truth, Alison didn't supervise much. Lewis spent most time with his grandmother, while his mother focused on her personal life, making up for time lost to pregnancy and early motherhood. And of course, Rebecca and Alison were clearly unhappy about Chad's marriage. They considered him their support and helper, almost their property. However, they initially had a wonderful relationship with Gail. Rebecca loudly proclaimed her joy at having a second daughter. Yes, that was how she called Gail. It was pleasant, though somewhat uncomfortable. Alison echoed her mother, repeatedly saying that she had always dreamed of having a sister. Lewis was also immediately drawn to Gail. The young woman noticed the boy lacked attention. It was clear that, although he lived with his grandmother and mother, neither particularly cared about his development. They had other priorities. Rebecca spent endless time with friends and visiting doctors in search of ailments. Alison was completely preoccupied with building her personal life. Initially, Gail and Alison became friends. The girls shared many common topics for conversation, being close in age. Gail found Alison's adventures fascinating. The stories sounded like plots from a TV series. As a storyteller, Chad's sister was wonderful. So in general, everything was progressing smoothly. After getting married, Gail and Chad took out a mortgage on a large apartment in a prestigious neighbourhood. Though the payments were exorbitant, both worked and believed they could manage the amount. They had to economise in many ways, but knew what they were working toward. They decided not to rush into having children. First, they needed to establish themselves and create financial stability. Though they dreamed of a baby, they realised the timing wasn't right. Chad's nephew frequently visited their family. Alison would bring him to Gail unexpected, sometimes in the evening. They lived near each other. "Let him sleep over, okay? I have a date that might last until morning," Alison would giggle. "And Mum's got blood pressure. Would you kindly help me out?" Gail would always nod in agreement. Being relatives meant helping each other, regardless of Chad being away on business trips or Gail having work to do at home. So Gail had to keep Lewis entertained. Yes, he was a quiet, calm, undemanding boy, and though Gail could have simply sat him in front of the TV or computer, she couldn't do that. Having a child visit meant cooking something special, providing entertainment and taking walks, essentially working as an evening nanny. Sometimes Alison would disappear for days, leaving Lewis with Gail and Chad, while Rebecca dealt with her blood pressure, country visits to friends, or clinic appointments. But a family is a family. Rebecca would smile warmly at Gail, often remarking how fortunate her daughter-in-law was to have a wonderful husband and a nice apartment, while lamenting that her own daughter attracted only unworthy suitors. Having witnessed Alison's many fleeting romances, Gail could have explained why this happened, but she remained silent to avoid unnecessary conflict, though she was growing weary of her mother-in-law's sudden visits and constant babysitting with her nephew, a boy who seemed unwanted, merely an inconvenience to his mother and grandmother. Meanwhile, Lewis gravitated toward Chad, and Gail grew to love him. And Rebecca and Alison took advantage of this, frequently leaving the boy with the couple. Several years passed like that, and Chad's career flourished as he became head of a large department. Though the work was demanding, the pay was excellent, and the couple decided it was finally time to pursue their dream of having children. Rebecca had long been asking for more grandchildren, though Gail couldn't understand why, since the grandmother showed little interest in caring for Lewis. Still, her mother-in-law frequently insisted they shouldn't delay having children. "You're both getting older," she would reason. "Chad's fine. A man can become a father at 70, but a woman's fertile years are limited. We need healthy, strong children. Older women usually have sickly babies, and we don't want that." Though Gail found these comments unpleasant, she acknowledged some truth in them. "Mum, everything will happen in due time," Chad would reassure his mother. "We have other plans for now." "Other plans? Or perhaps you're having difficulties? Maybe there's something wrong with your health?" Initially, Gail tried to counter Rebecca's assumptions, but eventually gave up. Her mother-in-law seemed almost pleased with her belief that her daughter-in-law had fertility problems. While she claimed to dream of grandchildren and expressed regret about the young couple's childlessness, she simultaneously praised her daughter. Alison had no fertility issues. She'd given birth to an excellent boy. The fact, Lewis's excellence, stemmed largely from his time with Gail and Chad, who helped with his schoolwork. Gail personally taught him to read, investing considerable time and effort, but she succeeded. When the first grader, barely knowing his letters, began struggling at school, Gail's heart went out to the boy. His inability to read, write, or count resulted from his mother's and grandmother's neglect. They hadn't worked with him. Gail wanted to confront her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, but chose to maintain peace. A poor peace was preferable to a good quarrel. The new relatives started irritating Gail. Their behaviour troubled her, and they apparently enjoyed discussing their daughter-in-law behind her back. This tension was palpable, though both sides maintained outward civility. Finally, the time came when Chad and Gail decided to become parents. They approached this decision methodically, both undergoing medical examinations and receiving confirmation of their health state before beginning to plan for a baby. Everything happened quickly, practically from the first try. Gail was surprised but delighted to see 2 stripes on the test. A wave of warmth and tenderness flooded her heart. Chad was overjoyed too. Their daughter, Stephanie, was born right on her due date. The young parents' happiness knew no bounds. The girl was strong, healthy, and perfect. Rebecca frequently visited her granddaughter and daughter-in-law, believing a new mother needed help. "I've always dreamed of having a daughter," she confided to her daughter-in-law. "When Chad was born, I was disappointed. Then came Alison, my ray of sunshine. Daughters are a mother's true joy. What are boys? They are just broken pieces. You can't imagine how upset I was when I learned Alison was having a boy." Gail looked at her mother-in-law in bewilderment. The woman spoke these words carelessly, not minding that her son and grandson could hear. But they seemed unfazed, probably accustomed to their mother and grandmother's thoughtless remarks. Even Lewis appeared indifferent to these words. Though Gail could have used help, Stephanie was an exceptionally calm baby. A true blessing, who slept, ate well, and smiled. Soon Rebecca's visits, however, created more problems than solutions. She would fuss over her granddaughter for 5 minutes, then spend hours chatting over tea. There was no real help, only disruption. Still, Gail kept her frustration to herself. After all, a grandmother had the right to see her granddaughter. Gail wouldn't prevent their relationship, especially since Rebecca had longed for a granddaughter. She found 10-year-old Lewis far more helpful. The teenager would stop by during his walks to entertain Stephanie and offer to run errands. Gail usually needed something, milk or bread. As Stephanie grew older, Lewis would even babysit her for short periods. He played with toys and told her stories. Gail tried not to take advantage of his help, but Lewis seemed eager to be needed. He was always enthusiastic to help. Maternity leave flew by quickly. Gail returned to work, and Stephanie started daycare. That's when the endless sick days began. Gail realized she couldn't pursue her career as intensively as before, needing to stay home with her ill daughter frequently. Chad couldn't leave his demanding job. Gail had to manage alone. She hoped Alison and Rebecca would help. Neither had ever held steady jobs, surviving on benefits and pensions, with Chad's additional support. Gail accepted this arrangement, but couldn't understand why still young Alison couldn't find work. Lewis was grown and independent now. Both his grandmother and mother had plenty of spare time now. They seemed like perfect helpers. Plus, they owed her. Gail had often babysat Lewis when he was young. It was a chance to return her favour, but things didn't work out that way. Whenever Gail asked Rebecca to watch her granddaughter, suddenly all her chronic ailments would flare up: blood pressure, heart problems, headaches, while Alison always had urgent matters. Gail eventually stopped asking, realizing it was pointless. She didn't want to sacrifice her career entirely, so they hired a nanny, though leaving their baby with a stranger was initially frightening. Lewis proved helpful here too. He'd check on his little cousin after school and report back to the worried parents that everything was smoothly and the nanny was excellent. Then one day, Rebecca, without consulting her son, decided to start a business. She became a distributor of expensive household products. The family struggled financially. Her theatre wardrobe job paid very little. Alison refused to work, claiming it was beneath her. She had made half-hearted attempts but quickly quit each time. She always referred to Lewis, saying he needed care and attention, though he received neither from his mother. Instead, he endured only criticism and complaints, preferring to spend his time at his uncle's apartment or outside. Then Rebecca discovered what seemed like an easy money-making opportunity. It required significant investment, so she mortgaged her apartment. She stocked up on household chemicals that supposedly would revolutionize housework. The products sounded miraculous in the description, but reality proved different. The business failed completely. Rebecca concealed her troubles until the end, hoping to appear successful to family and friends. She only turned to her son when bailiffs arrived to inventory her property. By then the apartment belonged to the bank. When Chad learned what his mother had done, He was furious. He berated both Rebecca and his sister. Gail had to calm him down, though equally shocked by their foolishness. She knew what's done was done. They needed to address the problems now. Chad hired skilled lawyers, but even they couldn't help. Rebecca and Alison lost their home, and Lewis with them. They had nowhere to go. Chad invited them to his apartment, giving them 2 large rooms. Stephanie had to move from her spacious nursery to a smaller room to accommodate Rebecca and Alison. When Gail suggested helping them rent an apartment instead, Chad rebuked her angrily, for the first time in their marriage. "These are my closest relatives, and they're in trouble. We must stick together and help each other in difficult times." "But no buts. Mum's right. You look down on them just because you've been luckier in life." It was painful. Gail always tried to be polite to Chad's mother and sister, though their behaviour often hurt and offended her. And now living with her overbearing mother-in-law became a true test for Gail. Alison and Rebecca constantly tried to change the young family's routines. The mother-in-law criticised how her daughter-in-law managed the household, claiming she wasted food, cleaned too rarely, and didn't raise the child properly. Since Chad was always at work, staying late or away on business trips, Gail had to bear the brunt of it all. It was exhausting for her. She couldn't even relax at home anymore, because, according to Rebecca, a mother and housewife must constantly attend to household chores, even when tired from work. Sometimes Rebecca would try to help her supposedly negligent daughter-in-law, though it would have been better if she hadn't. Gail would find her belongings in unexpected places, and her mother-in-law ruined numerous dishes and clothes. Not intentionally, of course. She simply didn't know how to handle delicate fabrics or specially coated dishes. Gail endured it because she believed her mother-in-law meant well. Fortunately, Alison rarely intervened. She was barely home, spending time with her new boyfriend at sanatoriums and local resorts. Rebecca proudly boasted about Alison's wealthy admirer. She ignored both his married status and the fact that Alison's teenage son Lewis, who desperately needed guidance, was left to fend for himself. He was in 9th grade and needed to consider his future career, but no one in the family seemed to care. Rebecca quickly assumed the role of mistress in her son's apartment. She had raised Chad on his feet and considered it her full merit that her child had achieved so much. Eventually Gail felt like an intruder in her own home. Rebecca dictated everything, what to do, when to cook, even bedtime. When Gail tried to establish boundaries, her mother-in-law would become dramatically offended, nearly crying. This would leave Gail flustered and apologising. When she complained to her husband, she received only cold, harsh responses. This was unlike Chad, who usually understood and supported her. His sudden change was both strange and hurtful. It took time for Gail to realise that Rebecca was skillfully turning her son against his wife. Through overheard conversations and careful observation, Gail discovered her mother-in-law's powerful influence over her husband. Since childhood, Chad had sought his mother's approval, and little had changed, and this revelation was deeply unsettling. Gail realised that to save her family, she needed her mother-in-law and sister-in-law to move out. She had no issues with Lewis, though. The teenager was doing well, living with his uncle and aunt. He had his own desk, received help with homework, and got proper attention. He also got along wonderfully with Stephanie. Since Gail's daughter had grown older, the woman trusted her to go on walks with Lewis. They visited amusement parks, went to the movies, and played in the yard. Gail knew Lewis would watch over Stephanie better than any nanny, never letting her out of his sight. One day, Gail proposed a solution to her husband. "Since we can afford it, Let's buy an apartment for Alison and Rebecca to live in separately. It'll be better for everyone. Plus it's a good investment. Real estate only appreciates in value. After consideration and discussion with his relatives, Chad agreed with his wife's proposal, especially since they had savings and he was earning well. Soon after Rebecca and Alison moved out, Gail could finally breathe freely. She was once again the mistress of her own home. They kept Lewis's room intact. Their nephew stayed over frequently, more often than in his own home. He had ideal studying conditions, a quiet environment, a workspace, and a powerful computer. Moreover, at Gail and Chad's house, no one criticised or insulted him. Gail enrolled him in online programming courses, and Lewis excelled immediately. She was delighted that the teenager had finally found his passion, rather than aimlessly hanging around with idle friends. She had worried about Lewis falling in with a bad crowd. Unlike his grandmother and mother, who showed no concern, Gail cared about his well-being. They had wanted a girl instead of him, yet ironically, they didn't want Stephanie, their granddaughter and niece either. It made no sense. As for Gail, she stopped worrying about it. She accepted Rebecca and Alison as they were. After all, peace, even an uneasy one, was better than conflict. She minimized contact with them, though Chad still visited regularly to help with repairs or moving furniture. Gail had her suspicions, though nothing concrete. She believed Alison and Rebecca continued to turn Chad against her, as he often returned from their visits agitated, complaining about unfinished dinners or untidiness. Gail reminded him that she also worked full-time while managing Stephanie's after-school activities. This seemed to help. Life continued. Stephanie grew and thrived. She started first grade. Lewis was in his final year, planning to study programming at a university in the capital. His numerous academic competition victories practically guaranteed his admission. He looked forward to his bright future while remaining tremendously helpful to Gail and Stephanie. He picked up Stephanie from after-school care when Gail worked late. Unlike Rebecca and Alison, Lewis was dependable. Gail trusted him completely. She knew he would never forget to collect Stephanie, would bring her home safely, feed her, check her homework, and keep her entertained. Lewis enjoyed spending time at Gail and Chad's home. He often expressed gratitude to Gail for her care, remembering how she played with him, taught him to read and count, and helped with his homework. "If you hadn't enrolled me in those programming courses, who knows where I'd be now?" Lewis once said. "I was getting involved with bad people back then out of pure boredom, but programming caught my interest, drew me in, and now I'm about to become a student at a prestigious university. I'll remember what you did for me my whole life." Gail was pleased with Lewis's words. Though he had grown distant over the years, she was touched to discover that teenagers could be so sensitive and grateful. Overall, Gail's life was excellent, though her relationship with her husband was strained by periodic reproaches and misunderstandings, especially regarding his mother and sister. They still held enormous influence over Chad, who still tried to earn their approval and attention like a teenager. Though he loved his wife and daughter and tried to please them too, his mother's and sister's opinions always took precedence. It was unpleasant, but manageable, until Stephanie's diagnosis turned their world upside down. The diagnosis was serious and frightening. The girl tired easily and looked pale. Lewis, who picked her up from school, often called Gail to report the little girl's headaches. When Gail took her daughter to the doctor, Stephanie underwent the necessary tests. The day the doctor delivered the diagnosis became forever etched in Gail's memory. Her life changed at that moment. Stephanie needed serious, systematic treatment, medicines, injections, and physical procedures. Rebecca offered to help, saying she had spare time at home anyway. She started picking Stephanie up after school and taking her to hospitals. Louis also wanted to help, but with his graduating class and numerous lessons and extra classes, the teenager simply couldn't manage it. Chad worked long hours, he couldn't get away, and Gail didn't want to burden him. He was their main breadwinner. They needed money now more than ever. Let him work. Everyone had their role. Whatever else could be said about Rebecca, Stephanie was her granddaughter. In this difficult time, the woman did come to their aid. Gail appreciated this. But then Rebecca began missing appointments. First once, then twice she overslept, and soon she was constantly complaining about her own health. Gail worried constantly. The treatment couldn't be interrupted even for a day. Stephanie's condition worsened until she could no longer attend school and had to study remotely. The little girl's strength diminished daily, and soon she wouldn't be able to handle even remote schooling. Gail tried explaining to her mother-in-law how crucial the regular hospital visits were. "You see, we can't skip procedures. It's dangerous." Yes, I'm sorry," Rebecca would say. "It won't happen again." But it did, repeatedly. Gail tried appealing to Chad about his mother. Though she knew her husband disliked criticism of his mother, she took this step. As expected, he reacted with indignation, listing all his mother's sacrifices and hardships. "I won't let you insult my mother in my own house. Mother is sacred." Gail didn't argue. She had neither the strength nor time. All her energy went to her daughter's treatment. During this difficult period, Louis became Gail's real support. Despite his challenging studies and exam preparation, he found time to walk with a weakening Stephanie in the park, read to her, play with her, and help her with lessons. These moments gave Gail brief chances to rest. But Louis's greatest gift was his naive teenage faith in a positive outcome. He never doubted Stephanie's recovery for a second. He always spoke of when Stephanie would be healthy, never if. Gail had to quit her job. Chad supported this decision, worried about their daughter, and glad she would have constant supervision. "That's how it should be. We're her parents. We should help her recover. We can't burden others with our problems." Chad was just repeating his mother's words. After so many years, Gail could recognize it. Now, Gail devoted herself entirely to her daughter. Chad worked from morning until night, and Gail's parents, living in another city, could only offer support by phone. Rebecca and Allison went about their usual routines, rarely visiting the apartment where seriously ill Stephanie lived. The atmosphere had become depressing, of course. The mother-in-law still visited occasionally, though it might have been better if she hadn't. These visits required Gail to serve tea with cookies or sweets, make conversation, and thoroughly clean the kitchen beforehand, hiding away the medicines and medical devices that helped keep Stephanie alive. After her mother-in-law left, Gail always felt heavy-hearted and sad. Rebecca frequently implied that Gail was to blame for her daughter's illness, suggesting she had fed or dressed the child incorrectly or missed early warning signs. Though she never made direct accusations that Gail could firmly refute, her belief in her daughter-in-law's guilt was clear. Then Louis, Gail's helper and Stephanie's friend, who could always make her laugh, left for university. Before leaving, he had a serious talk with Gail. "I could stay here with you and enroll later," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "How will you and Stephanie manage without me?" These words touched Gail deeply, confirming again that Louis was true family, someone she could rely on. But Louis was young, and he should live his own life. Yet his absence would make things harder, but he needed his education. He couldn't miss this opportunity at a prestigious university in the capital. He had worked toward it for so long. Gail immediately refused his offer and insisted he go study. Lewis often called, asking about Stephanie and sharing stories from his student life. The capable young man was thriving, excelling in his studies, working part-time, making new friends, and even meeting a girlfriend. He only told Gail about Annie. He generally kept such details from his mother and grandmother, feeling no need to share with them. Lewis could discuss everything with Gail, and she was glad of it. He had grown into a good young man, intelligent, caring and responsible. Gail believed with good reason that she had contributed to this. She had spent a lot of time with the boy, something Lewis himself often acknowledged. Meanwhile, like a fierce tigress, Gail fought one-on-one with her daughter's disease, searching for doctors and researching new treatment methods. Chad worked even harder now, handling all financial matters. Each parent shouldered their part of the care, and it exhausted them both. At first, the disease seemed to be winning, with Stephanie being rushed to intensive care several times. The doctor's warning that there was no prognosis filled Gail with cold horror. The battle seemed lost. Everything was so serious. More than once, Gail wanted to give up, simply having no strength left. But the woman pulled herself together, put everything else aside, and continued fighting for her daughter's life. Stephanie grew weaker and thinner, becoming almost transparent, and for a time she couldn't get out of bed. Then Lewis found a professor in the capital and described the situation to him. After all other doctors had refused to treat Stephanie, this man agreed to include her in his experimental treatment. Gail video-called the professor, explaining her daughter's illness in detail and showing him the medical documents.
"Yes, she's precisely the kind of patient I work with,"
the grey-haired elderly man exclaimed from the computer screen, his eyes burning with enthusiasm. That's when Gail's instincts told her everything would be fine, though she dared not hope too much. Stephanie began the experimental treatment. Initially, her condition worsened. Gail wanted to stop, but the professor insisted they continue.
"I understand your fear. It's terrifying to see your child in such a state. While there's no guarantee of a cure, you have no other options. If I were you, I'd take the risk."
After careful consideration, Gail realized the doctor's logic was sound. Chad supported his wife's decision, but Rebecca criticized their choice, warning them not to trust this unknown professor.
"He's just after your money,"
the elderly woman said, pressing her lips together.
"The child is hopeless. You'd be better off using that money to place her in a good boarding school, where she'll be better cared for than at home or in hospitals."
These words made Gail want to lash out at her mother-in-law. A boarding school? How could she call the child hopeless? But Gail restrained herself. She needed to focus all her energy on her daughter's treatment. Time passed, and suddenly Stephanie began to recover dramatically. Her test results steadily improved, and she blossomed visibly. She laughed again, watched cartoons and ate with appetite. She became herself again. Soon she was running through hospital corridors with new friends, while Gail watched in disbelief and fear at her. Chad, too, breathed a sigh of relief. He had aged considerably during the 3 years his daughter had hung between life and death. Now Stephanie was almost perfectly healthy. The professor who had treated her shared in their joy.
"She'll need special care and rehabilitation for a couple of years, with regular blood monitoring, but I can confidently say the disease has retreated permanently. We literally snapped Stephanie from its clutches." Moreover, hundreds of children worldwide in similar situations will now receive proper treatment.
Life changed again. Gradually, everything returned to normal. Stephanie started school, and though she had to work hard to catch up with her peers, she succeeded. Gail still couldn't work, as Stephanie needed extensive training, and also rehabilitation demanded her full attention. But it was such a welcome task that Gail felt completely happy. The danger had passed. That was what mattered most. Lewis, during his vacations, visited them frequently. After graduation, he brought Annie, his future bride, to his hometown and asked to stay with them.
You know how mother and grandmother are. They might say something inappropriate to Annie.
Gail understood perfectly well what he meant. She gladly welcomed her nephew and his fiancée, who proved to be a lovely and pleasant young woman. Everything went well for Lewis. His talent and promise earned him an immediate position at a major IT company. When he shared the news, his eyes sparkled with excitement, and Gail felt proud and happy for him. Years passed. Stephanie grew stronger. Rehabilitation was no longer necessary. She attended school and even took up sports, particularly swimming, which the professor highly recommended. Eventually, Gail realized she could return to work. Being a housewife had begun to feel confining. Something was missing. She felt stifled within four walls. Cooking, cleaning, and helping with housework had become an endless Groundhog Day, especially for someone who had once been a sought-after professional. Starting over after such a long break was challenging, but necessary. Chad and Stephanie supported her decision. Gail returned to the same company she'd left. Everything had changed, of course. New people occupied the top positions, and almost none of her former colleagues remained. But that was natural after so much time. Everything had to be relearned. Sometimes Gail worked late at the office, but she felt happy and fulfilled for the first time in years. Life seemed to improve in every way, though Alison and Rebecca still cast occasional shadows on it. Once Stephanie fully recovered, these women became frequent visitors again, constantly seeking help and playing on family ties. Alison kept being idle. But now other issues have arisen. Like Rebecca, before her, Alison began desperately searching for doctors, convincing everybody that she had serious ailments. Rebecca was now really old to work. Mother and daughter lived on her pension alone, and they never had enough money, so they were used to visiting Gail in the evenings. They would drink tea, talk about Stephanie, and socialise like family. Since they didn't need to work in the mornings, they would stay up late, filling Gail's ears with unnecessary neighbourhood gossip and endless chatter. And as if that weren't enough, they frequently borrowed money, lamenting their difficult circumstances. This was although Chad, as Gail knew well, gave them a substantial monthly allowance. Gail also gave money to her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, knowing full well it would never be repaid. But what choice did she have, knowing how devoted her husband was to his family? Why create another conflict? Gail wanted peace. At work, things were flourishing. She was developing professionally. Despite her long absence, she quickly reintegrated into work, catching on rapidly. Her supervisors valued her diligence and reliability. Gail climbed the career ladder, eventually becoming head of a small department. The position came with responsibilities, including business trips. Chad wasn't thrilled about this. He was accustomed to coming home to a clean house, a hot dinner, and Stephanie with completed homework. During his wife's absences on business trips, these responsibilities would fall to him. He wasn't prepared for this change. However, the trips weren't frequent. Gail always gave her husband advance notice so he could adjust his work schedule accordingly. Everything ran smoothly until Gail needed to make an urgent business trip. She tried calling Chad, but he didn't answer. It wasn't unusual. He was probably in a meeting or had misplaced his phone. Gail returned home that evening just to pack what she needed for the trip. She was rushing to catch her flight. She planned to say goodbye to Stephanie and leave a note for her husband, but Chad was home, in excellent spirits. His mother had called. She and Alison were returning. This was happy news for him. Rebecca and Alison were leaving to visit relatives in the village for a month. Chad worried about them. He still felt responsible for his mother and sister. Gail often wondered, how had they managed to bind him so tightly? Chad was strong, independent, decisive, and rarely let anyone take advantage of him. That's how he was with everyone else. But his mother and sister were untouchable. This attitude was rooted in his childhood and teenage years. Gail had even considered sending her husband to a psychologist. His behaviour seemed abnormal. Chad himself suffered from it all. "Send them my regards," Gail smiled dutifully, packing her suitcase. "What do you mean, regards? Where are you going?" Chad asked. "I have an urgent business trip for 3 days. I've sent you a message detailing Stephanie's schedule, when to take her to the pool, to school, and she absolutely must take her tests on the 3rd day." "What do you mean, an urgent business trip?" Chad was visibly angry. "My mother and sister are returning after so long, and you won't even prepare a festive dinner for them? That's disrespectful." Gail tried to maintain her composure. Lately, Chad had become increasingly sensitive about any shred of disrespect toward his relatives. "You could order restaurant delivery, and if they're hungry, they can manage that themselves." "Again, you're speaking disrespectfully about my mother." Chad lost his temper completely. "Mum is right. You hate them and constantly demean them. All they want is family time." "Chad, be quiet. You're staying home and can cook dinner. Turkey with gravy, your mother's favourite." "And Alison loves shrimp Caesar salad. I'll transfer money for groceries now." "You realise I'll lose my job if I stay," Gail said. "You don't need that job anyway, with its constant business trips and late office hours. Stay home and care for our child. Stephanie's growing up without attention. Alison's right." Gail grew indignant, choking with anger. She must have looked furious, because Chad finally fell silent and for once listened to his wife. And Gail unleashed everything. She poured out all she had bottled up inside. The arrogance and unkindness of her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, masked by fake friendliness, their constant visits, their parasitic behaviour. She reminded him how they were absent when help was needed, and mentioned Louis, whom she had helped to success in life. His mother and grandmother had ignored the boy until he became successful and wealthy. Thankfully, Louis resisted manipulation, seeing through his relatives, unlike his uncle, and kept his distance, earning himself the label of ungrateful son and grandson. After hearing his wife out, Chad collapsed into a chair. Gail felt relieved after speaking her mind. She didn't regret a single word, and realised she should have spoken up years ago. She should have voiced her displeasure directly, confronted the presumptuous relatives, and shown Chad the reality instead of protecting his feelings. Gail acknowledged her part in letting things escalate so far, but she wouldn't tolerate it any more. She watched her husband, waiting for his response. His expression was unreadable. "I hope you understand," Chad finally said, "that after this we can no longer live in the same apartment. We're not a family anymore. You hate the people closest to me." "Are you crazy? Your closest family member is our daughter," Gail replied. Her voice trembled as she realised Her husband had already made his choice.
"Get out of here," the man said, barely containing his rage. "Go away. I can't look at you. Get out of my house."
Gail nodded silently. Yes, the apartment was indeed registered to Chad. He had bought it during Stephanie's illness. There was nothing she could do about it. Rebecca had encouraged her son to formalise the property so that, despite being purchased during the marriage, it remained Chad's sole property. She certainly knew how to navigate legal intricacies when needed. Fear gripped Gail. Where would she go with a child? She had no apartment of her own. Thankfully, she had savings. She had been saving for a month-long summer vacation by the sea with Stephanie. Now those funds would have to go toward rent. Gail opened the apartment door with her key. Her own apartment. She hadn't expected this turn of events. Yet, just a month after separating from Chad, her life transformed dramatically. Now she and her daughter lived in the capital. She worked at a large company, earning a salary she couldn't have dreamed of in her hometown. Gail felt free and independent. Only now did she realise how heavily the situation with her mother-in-law and sister-in-law had weighed on her, along with Chad's constant siding with his relatives. She could breathe easier now. Help arrived unexpectedly through Lewis. He had called once to check on her, and though she didn't want to burden her nephew with problems, he sensed something was wrong in her voice and pressed for answers. When Gail told Lewis everything, he laughed joyfully. "Finally, you've understood. I've watched you struggle since school, never understanding why you put up with it all. I'm glad you've escaped that family." Lewis's reaction helped Gail see the situation differently. This wasn't a misfortune. It was liberation, though it pained her to be without a home at her age. As if reading her thoughts, Lewis called a week later to announce he had bought an apartment for her and Stephanie in the capital, near him and Annie. "Come soon," he said. "You'll have a new home, and I'll help you find work." It seemed too generous a gift to accept, but then Lewis revealed just how successful he had become as a programmer. He even showed his tax returns to prove he could afford such a purchase. "Gail, you were the only one in the family who treated me humanely. My mother and grandmother ignored me. If not for you, I wouldn't be who I am today." "You know," he continued, "they say blood relatives aren't necessarily your closest people. That's precisely how it worked out in my life. We're close, and we should support each other." His words moved Gail to tears. When Rebecca and Alison learned that Lewis had bought Gail an apartment and secured her a high-paying job, they were furious. They came to the capital, demanding their fair share from Lewis and Gail, but left empty-handed.